It was a late summer night, one of those heavy, humid evenings where the air sticks to your skin, and everything feels just a little bit off. That's how it was that night when Sean and I decided to do something stupid, something we had talked about for weeks but never had the guts to follow through with. That night, we were going to the old, abandoned church on the outskirts of town, and we were bringing a Ouija board with us. Sean and I had been best friends since we were kids, growing up in the same small New Jersey town. At 19, we were stuck in that awkward phase of life where you're not a kid anymore but not really an adult either. Most of our friends had gone off to college or gotten jobs, but Sean and I, we were still here, killing time in a town that felt too small for the both of us. So, we got into dumb stuff. You know, exploring places we shouldn't, daring each other to do things we knew were stupid. And that's how we ended up in front of that church. The place had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Old and crumbling, with broken stained glass windows and weeds growing up through the cracked pavement, it looked like something straight out of a horror movie. I didn't know much about its history, just that it had been closed down years ago after some kind of accident. Nobody really talked about it anymore. It was just there. A looming, forgotten relic at the edge of town. "Come on, James," Sean had said earlier that evening, his eyes gleaming with that reckless energy I always admired and feared at the same time. "We're going tonight. Just the two of us, and we're bringing the board." At first, I'd hesitated. Sure, we had talked about it, laughed it off like some big joke, but the idea of actually doing it sent a shiver down my spine. There was something about that church that didn't sit right with me, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up whenever I passed it. But Sean had a way of getting under my skin, making me feel like a coward if I didn't go along with his plans. So I agreed. And now, here we were, standing in front of the church with that stupid Ouija board tucked under Sean's arm. It was close to midnight when we pushed open the creaky iron gate that led to the churchyard. The place was even creepier up close. The moon was out, casting long shadows across the cracked stone steps leading up to the entrance. I could hear the sound of crickets chirping in the distance, but it only made the silence around the church more deafening. "Let's do this," Sean said, his voice low but steady. He pulled the Ouija board out of his backpack and held it up like it was some kind of trophy. I swallowed hard, feeling my stomach churn with nerves, but I didn't say anything. We were here now. There was no backing out. We made our way inside the church, our footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The air was thick and musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust floated in the air, visible in the beams of moonlight streaming through the broken windows. The pews were still there, though most of them had collapsed or rotted away. At the far end of the church, where the altar used to be, there was nothing but darkness. "Here," Sean said, dropping the Ouija board on the floor in the center of the aisle. He sat down cross-legged and motioned for me to do the same. Reluctantly, I joined him, my heart pounding in my chest. We set the planchette on the board and placed our fingers on it, just like we'd seen in the movies. I tried to steady my breathing, but it was hard. My palms were slick with sweat, and my fingers trembled ever so slightly. Sean was the first to speak. "Is there anyone here with us?" His voice was calm, almost mocking. He didn't really believe in this stuff. Neither did I, at least not entirely. But something about being in that church, with the Ouija board in front of us, made me question everything. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The planchette didn't move. The air around us felt still, like the world was holding its breath. I started to relax a little, thinking this was just a dumb prank we were pulling on ourselves. But then I heard it, a soft, faint sound, like the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze, my eyes darting around the dark corners of the church. Sean heard it too. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tightened around the edge of the planchette. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Sean didn't answer right away. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide. "It's probably just an animal or something," he said, but there was no confidence in his voice anymore. Before I could respond, something small and hard landed on the board between us with a soft thud. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. It was a rock, a small, jagged piece of stone that looked like it had come from one of the broken walls. I stared at it, my mind racing. Where the hell had that come from? Sean stood up abruptly, his face pale. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight with fear. I didn't argue. We grabbed our stuff and bolted for the door, not bothering to look back. As we ran out of the church, I could swear I heard something, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, and it followed us all the way to the edge of the churchyard. We didn't stop running until we were back on the main road, panting and out of breath. Neither of us said a word the entire way home. The Ouija board was still in the church, but there was no way in hell we were going back for it. Not after what we'd heard. Not after what we'd seen. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the church. About the rock that had landed on the board. About the sound I'd heard as we ran out. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something had happened in that church, and it wasn't over yet. The next day, Sean called me. He sounded different, nervous, anxious, not the carefree guy I knew. "I'm going back to get the board," he said flatly. "What? Are you out of your mind? After what happened last night?" I shot back, incredulous. "I left it there, James. I need to get it back." His voice was insistent, but I could tell even he didn't fully believe his reasoning. Against my better judgment, I didn't try to stop him. Looking back, I wish I had. Because that's when everything really started to go wrong. The day dragged on after that phone call. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. Every now and then, I would check my phone, half expecting Sean to text me or call and say he made it back from the church. But no messages came. By evening, the pit in my stomach had grown into full-blown anxiety. I kept replaying the night before over and over in my head. The sound of that rock hitting the board, the noises, the heavy atmosphere in the church. It didn't feel like some cheap thrill anymore. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure what. All I knew was that Sean was walking straight back into it, and I didn't have the courage to follow him. Around 7 p.m., the sun began to set. It painted the sky in deep oranges and purples, but instead of feeling peaceful, the fading light made everything seem more sinister. Shadows lengthened, crawling across the streets like dark fingers reaching out for something, someone. My mind was spinning, restless. I could feel it in my bones. Something bad was going to happen. Then the call came. My phone buzzed, and I nearly dropped it in my haste to answer. "Sean?" I said, my voice catching in my throat. But it wasn't Sean. "James? It's Sean's mom." Her voice was tight with worry, like she'd been holding back panic for hours. "Is Sean with you? He hasn't come home, and I can't reach him on his phone. He said he was meeting up with you earlier." My blood ran cold. No, he went to the church. I told him not to, but I stopped myself, realizing I was only going to make her worry more. "The church?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "That place? Why on earth would he go there?" I didn't know how to explain. How do you tell someone that their son went back to a haunted church to retrieve a Ouija board, because he didn't want to leave it behind? It sounded insane. "I'll go find him," I said quickly, trying to calm her, and myself. "I'll head over there right now. Don't worry, Mrs. Parker, I'll bring him home." I hung up before she could say anything else and grabbed my jacket. As much as I didn't want to go back, I knew I had no choice. Sean was my best friend, and if something had happened to him in that church, well, I couldn't just sit at home waiting. The walk to the church felt longer than it had the night before. With every step, the air seemed to grow colder, the night darker. My heart pounded in my chest as I neared the familiar site of the abandoned building, its jagged silhouette outlined against the last bits of twilight. The gate was slightly ajar, just as we'd left it. I stood there for a moment, staring at the old, broken church. My legs felt like lead, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. Sean was in there, somewhere, and I had to find him. The inside of the church was just as empty and desolate as it had been the night before, but now it felt worse. The silence pressed in on me, thick and oppressive. I fumbled for the flashlight on my phone, casting a weak beam of light across the decaying pews and the broken altar at the far end. "Sean?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. The only response was the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the walls. I made my way to the spot where we had left the Ouija board. The floor was cold beneath my feet, and the air had that same musty smell of rot and abandonment. But the board was gone. Panic surged through me. Sean must have taken it, right? He came here, grabbed the board and... what? Left? But then why hadn't he gone home? I turned in a slow circle, scanning the shadows with my light. Something was wrong. I could feel it. Suddenly, a noise, a faint shuffling sound, came from the back of the church, near the altar. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, listening. "Sean?" I called again, my voice trembling. No answer. The shuffling sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't footsteps, exactly. It was more like something dragging across the ground. My skin prickled with dread. I took a hesitant step forward, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Sean, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. Then I saw it. In the dim light of my phone, I caught a glimpse of movement near the altar, something hunched and dark, just beyond the reach of my beam. It was moving slowly, deliberately. My heart hammered in my chest as I took a step back, my pulse roaring in my ears. "Who's there?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. The figure moved closer, stepping into the faint light. It was Sean. Relief washed over me for a split second, until I realized something was terribly, horribly wrong. Sean's face was pale, almost gray, his eyes wide and vacant. He was holding the Ouija board in his hands, but it looked different, warped, like the wood had twisted and blackened. His movements were slow, unnatural, like he was fighting against something invisible. "Sean?" I whispered, fear lacing my voice. He didn't respond. He just kept walking toward me, his eyes locked on the board, his expression blank and empty. The air around him felt wrong, thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. "Sean, stop!" I yelled, backing away. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs felt like they were about to give out. But he didn't stop. He kept coming, step by step, until he was only a few feet away from me. Then he spoke, his voice low and guttural, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside him. "It's not mine anymore," he said, his eyes never leaving the board. "It's theirs now." I stumbled back, fear flooding my veins. I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't want to find out. Without thinking, I turned and ran, bolting for the door. My legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop. I could hear Sean, or whatever had taken control of him, behind me, his footsteps slow but steady. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I burst through the church doors and into the night, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, the church fading into the distance behind me. I never saw Sean again. The police searched the church the next day, but there was no sign of him. No Ouija board. Nothing. He had simply disappeared. To this day, I don't know what happened in that church. All I know is that something evil was there that night. Something we never should have messed with. And it took Sean with it. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind that felt lazy and unhurried. Sarah and I had been driving for hours, weaving through the backroads of Warren County, Georgia. We weren't looking for anything in particular, just the thrill of exploring the unknown. It was one of our quirks as a couple. Sarah loved old, forgotten places, and I had a soft spot for getting lost in rural towns that felt like they had been left behind by time. The landscape around us was a mix of dry, overgrown fields and patches of dense forest. Every now and then, we'd pass an abandoned farmhouse or a dilapidated barn, their weathered wood looking like it might crumble if you so much as whispered at it. We didn't see many other cars, and the few people we passed didn't seem too interested in waving or acknowledging us. It was like we were intruding on something private, something they preferred to keep to themselves. After a while, the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows, and I could see the weariness setting into Sarah's face. We hadn't seen much that day, and part of me wondered if we should just head back toward the main road. That's when we saw it, a small church, nestled at the end of a narrow dirt path. The church itself was nothing impressive, just a single-story building with peeling white paint and a cross that looked like it had seen better days. But the parking lot, it was full of cars. "Odd, isn't it?" Sarah said, leaning forward in her seat to get a better look. "I mean, out here in the middle of nowhere. What do you think's going on?" I shrugged, curiosity tugging at me. "Probably just a local service or something. But look at all those cars. I didn't think we'd passed enough houses to fill a parking lot." We exchanged a glance. This was exactly the sort of thing Sarah and I thrived on. Something strange, something out of place. We were both thinking the same thing. "Wanna check it out?" I asked. Sarah grinned. "Obviously." We pulled the car into the parking lot, noting that most of the vehicles were older, beaten-up pickups and vans, nothing too out of the ordinary for a rural town. But still, something felt off. As we walked toward the church, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something unsettling about the silence around the place, like the world was holding its breath. The door to the church creaked open easily, revealing a dimly lit interior. I expected to hear voices, maybe hymns being sung or a preacher droning on, but instead, there was only a low murmur of conversation. It stopped the moment we stepped inside. There couldn't have been more than 15 or 20 people in the pews, mostly men in their 30s and 40s. Their faces were blank, expressionless, and their eyes, their eyes, followed us in unison as we stood awkwardly in the doorway. The air felt thick with tension, like we had interrupted something important, something we weren't supposed to see. "Maybe we should go," I whispered to Sarah, but she just shook her head slightly, her curiosity outweighing the creeping unease. One of the men, sitting near the front, stood up. He was tall and broad, wearing a dark jacket, and there was something off about him. I couldn't quite place it until he turned to face us fully. He was wearing a mask. It wasn't a Halloween mask or anything like that, just a plain white face mask, the kind you might see in a medical setting. But here, in this tiny church, surrounded by these silent people, it felt like the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "Leave. Now." I glanced at Sarah, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker across her face. The man hadn't raised his voice, but there was a menace in his words that sent a chill down my spine. "Sorry, we didn't mean to interrupt," I said quickly, my voice sounding shaky even to my own ears. "We'll just leave," the man repeated, and this time, the entire congregation turned in their seats to glare at us. Sarah grabbed my arm, and without another word, we turned and bolted out the door. The cool evening air hit us like a slap to the face as we hurried back to the car. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and Sarah's breathing was fast and shallow. I fumbled with the keys, trying to stay calm, but my hands were trembling. As soon as the engine roared to life, we sped out of the parking lot, gravel kicking up behind us. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the masked man standing in the doorway, watching us. But the church looked as deserted as ever. "What the hell was that?" Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But something wasn't right about that place. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the tension between us thick. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we had just experienced. It was just a church, right? So why had they reacted like that? And what was with the mask? I was about to say something to Sarah when I noticed headlights in the rearview mirror. A van. It was following us. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked, my voice tense. Sarah turned to look. "Yeah, it's been behind us since we left." My stomach twisted in knots. I pressed down on the gas pedal, and the van matched our speed. Something was very, very wrong. We were miles from anywhere. No towns, no gas stations, nothing but miles of endless trees and darkness creeping in. The van stayed behind us, its headlights a constant presence in the mirror. It wasn't trying to overtake us, but it wasn't backing off either. "Do you think it's them?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. She was gripping the edge of her seat, eyes darting between the road and the van behind us. "I don't know," I said, though the pit in my stomach told me I did know. The men from the church, the ones with their cold, dead stares, it had to be them. Something about the way they had looked at us, the way the masked man had told us to leave, it felt too deliberate. Too much like we had seen something we weren't supposed to. I tried to think rationally, tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe this was just some local who happened to be heading in the same direction. But deep down, I knew better. I pushed the car faster, the trees on either side of the road becoming a blur as we sped through the night. The van kept pace. There was something predatory about the way it followed us, like it was waiting for the right moment to make its move. "We need to get to the sheriff's office," I said, my voice tight. It was the only plan I could come up with. Ben de NOI. Teep TUC. ChatGPT de NOI. ChatGPT. Part 2. The road stretched out endlessly in front of us, a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through the thick Georgia woods. I could feel the tension between us growing with every second, every heartbeat. The van was still there, following us like a shadow that refused to be shaken. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Sarah was hunched forward, staring at the road as if her focus could somehow change our reality. "You sure we're heading the right way?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think so," I said, though truthfully, I had no idea. I'd only seen a sign for the sheriff's office once, back when we first entered this part of Warren County, and that was hours ago. I wasn't even sure if it was open, or if we were still on the right road. But I had to hope it was somewhere close. The headlights from the van never wavered. They were like twin eyes, watching us, following our every move. We had passed through stretches of forest and open fields, and still, the van remained. Every turn I made, every attempt to lose it, was futile. It felt like we were being herded, pushed in a direction we didn't want to go. I glanced at Sarah. Her face was pale, her fingers trembling as she ran them through her hair. She'd been so curious back at the church, but now, that curiosity had turned into raw fear. I could see it in her eyes, the way they darted between the side mirror and the road ahead. "We're not gonna lose them, are we?" she asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. "No," I said quietly, swallowing hard. "We're not." Panic was rising in me like bile, but I knew I had to keep it together, for both of us. I had no idea what those people back at the church were capable of, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. After what felt like an eternity, we passed a small sign that read, "Sheriff's Office, 2 miles." Relief flooded through me. Finally, something familiar, something real. "We're close," I said, my voice tight with a mixture of hope and desperation. "Just a couple more miles." Sarah nodded, gripping the door handle tightly as if preparing for something, though either of us knew what. The road twisted ahead, and the sheriff's office came into view, a small, squat building surrounded by a gravel lot and a few dim streetlights. It wasn't much, but it was a beacon of hope in the middle of the encroaching night. I pulled into the lot, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires breaking the eerie silence that had followed us for miles. The van didn't pull in. It stopped at the edge of the lot, idling just far enough away to remain in the shadows. I could see the outline of it now, dark and menacing, its headlights still burning bright. "Come on, let's go inside," I said, yanking the key out of the ignition and scrambling out of the car. Sarah followed, her steps quick and nervous. The front door of the sheriff's office was unlocked, and we burst inside, breathing hard. The place was small, just a couple of desks, a few filing cabinets, and a door leading to what I assumed were the holding cells. There was a single officer behind the desk, a grizzled man in his late 50s with a thick mustache and weary eyes. He looked up, startled by our entrance. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, standing slowly. We need help," I said, struggling to catch my breath. "There's a van. It's been following us for miles. We think it's from that church down the road." The officer's face changed. His expression, once mildly concerned, shifted to something colder, something harder to read. He stepped around the desk, his boots thudding softly against the floor. "You been to the old church?" he asked, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "Yeah," Sarah said, her voice quivering. "We didn't mean to. We were just curious. We went inside, and they told us to leave. But now they're following us." The officer looked past us, through the glass door, to the van sitting at the edge of the lot. His jaw tightened slightly. He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat before turning back to us. "Folks around here don't take kindly to strangers poking around where they don't belong," he said slowly. There was something unsettling in the way he said it, like he wasn't entirely on our side. "Best thing you can do is head on out, keep moving. Don't look back." I blinked, not quite understanding. "What?" "But they're following us. We thought you could help." He sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "Ain't much I can do if you've stirred up trouble with them. They keep to themselves, mostly. But you cross them and, well..." He let the sentence hang in the air like a threat. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling with frustration and fear. "What do you mean, keep to themselves? They're following us. Isn't it your job to protect people?" The officer's eyes darkened. "Not from them." There was a long, heavy silence. I didn't know what to say. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The van, the church, the people inside. They were more than just a strange congregation. This was something bigger, something the local law didn't want to get involved in. I felt Sarah's hand grip my arm, pulling me back. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The officer watched us for a moment longer before turning and walking back behind his desk, as if the conversation was over. "You take care now," he said, sitting down heavily in his chair. We didn't argue. I grabbed Sarah's hand, and we bolted back to the car. The van was still there, its engine rumbling softly in the night. As we sped out of the parking lot, my mind raced. The sheriff wasn't going to help us. Whatever we had stumbled into back at that church, it was bigger than we could have imagined. And now, there was no escaping it. The van pulled out behind us, its headlights cutting through the darkness. They were still following us. I never told anyone how that day stuck with me, how it dug its claws into my mind and never let go. Even now, years later, I still see his face in my dreams, those pale, sunken eyes that seemed to follow me everywhere. I was just a kid, barely 10 years old, and had recently joined the Cub Scouts. We met in the basement of St. Mary's Catholic School, a small, unassuming place with old brick walls and stained glass windows. I liked it there. Something about the smell of old books and candles burning in the corners felt comforting. But that day, everything changed. It all started a few days before during Sunday Massachusetts. I'd gone with my mom, like we did every week. We sat in our usual pew, somewhere in the middle, not too close to the altar. I remember the priest's droning voice, his words like a lullaby, making me nod off even though I knew I wasn't supposed to. But then, something strange happened. I felt it before I saw it, a prickling on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned my head and sure enough, there he was. A man sitting a few rows back, staring directly at me. He wasn't old, but he wasn't young either. Maybe somewhere in his 30s or 40s. His face was pale and drawn, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes, those dark, sunken eyes, were fixed on me, unblinking. At first, I thought maybe he was looking at someone behind me, but when I shifted in my seat, his gaze followed. He didn't look away, didn't even flinch. It was like he was studying me, trying to memorize every detail of my face. I nudged my mom, whispered, "Mom, that man is staring at me." She turned around, and I saw the same discomfort wash over her face. She glanced back quickly, then whispered, "Just ignore him, honey. It's probably nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. Every time I glanced back, there he was, still watching, his face twisted into this strange, unsettling grin. I couldn't focus on anything else for the rest of the service. His face haunted me even as we left the church, lingering in the back of my mind. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Just some weird guy at church, right? People can be strange sometimes. But then, a few days later, during our Cub Scout meeting, it happened again. We were in the middle of a scavenger hunt. The leaders had hidden little trinkets and toys all over the school, and we were supposed to find as many as we could. It was fun at first, running through the hallways with my friends, laughing and shouting whenever we found something. I was in the lead, clutching a small toy car in my hand, when I found myself alone in a narrow hallway at the far end of the school. That's when I saw him. At first, I didn't realize it was him. The hallway was dimly lit, and he was standing at the far end, his back to me. But as I got closer, something about his posture seemed familiar. Then he turned around, and my stomach dropped. It was the man from the church. He smiled when he saw me, the same unnerving grin from before. He didn't say anything at first, just started walking toward me, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt frozen in place. "Hey there," he finally said, his voice low and raspy. "I remember you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could do was stare at him as he got closer and closer. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. "You're a Cub Scout, right?" he asked, his grin widening. "What are you doing all alone?" That's when he reached out, his hand cold and bony as it wrapped around my wrist. His grip was tight, too tight, like he wasn't planning to let go. He tugged at me, pulling me toward the door at the end of the hallway. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I want to show you something." Panic shot through me. Every instinct in my body screamed that I needed to get away, that this man was dangerous. I tried to pull my arm free, but his grip was iron. Tears welled up in my eyes as I yanked harder, my voice finally breaking free in a scream. "Help! Someone help me!" I don't know if it was luck or some miracle, but at that exact moment, I heard footsteps pounding down the hall. My cub master, Mr. Parker, appeared at the other end, his face twisted in confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" he barked. The man let go of me so quickly I almost fell backward. He didn't say anything, didn't even look at Mr. Parker. He just turned and bolted through the door at the end of the hall. I stood there shaking, my heart pounding in my chest as Mr. Parker rushed over to me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. I nodded even though I wasn't. I wasn't okay at all. I felt like I was going to throw up, my legs weak beneath me. But I couldn't get any words out. All I could do was stare at the door where the man had disappeared. He tried to take me. I finally managed to whisper. "That man from the church. He tried to take me." Mr. Parker's face went pale, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the door. Without another word, he put his arm around my shoulders and guided me back to the main meeting room, where the other kids were still running around, oblivious to what had just happened. I thought maybe that was the end of it. I had escaped. I was safe now, right? But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The man from the church wasn't done with me yet. The days after the incident blurred into a strange fog of fear and confusion. My mom was the first person I told, of course. I thought she'd lose it right there when I described the man from the church and how he had tried to pull me away. But instead, she grew quiet, her face drained of color, like she'd expected something like this to happen. "We need to tell someone," she said, her voice trembling. Someone at the church, or the police. But before we could do anything, Mr. Parker had already taken matters into his own hands. He reported what happened to the church officials, and within days, things escalated faster than I could comprehend. The priest, Father O'Connell, asked to meet with me and my mom in his office at St. Mary's. I remember sitting there, fidgeting with my hands, the air heavy with the scent of old leather and incense. Father O'Connell sat across from us, his fingers steepled, his face a mask of calm concern. But there was something in his eyes, something cold and distant, that put me on edge. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "We've been made aware of the man in question. He was an employee of the church, but I assure you, he will no longer be around." The way he said it, so flat, so matter-of-fact, made me shiver. It was like he was brushing it off, as if it were just another item on his long list of things to handle. But it wasn't just something to handle. It was terrifying. "Who is he?" my mom asked, her voice sharper than usual. "Why was he even working here if he's dangerous?" Father O'Connell hesitated, just for a second, before he leaned back in his chair. "His name is John," he said. "He was part of the church's maintenance staff. He's had problems in the past, but we believed he had changed." I looked at my mom, seeing her face tighten, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't like that answer, and neither did I. "What kind of problems?" she pressed. Father O'Connell sighed, as if he was tired of the conversation already. "There were allegations. Years ago. Nothing was ever proven, but we thought it best to let him go after this incident." Allegations. The word hung in the air like smoke. I didn't fully understand it then, but I could tell it was bad. Really bad. As we left the office, I caught Father O'Connell giving my mom a look, one that I couldn't quite read. It wasn't just concern, it was something deeper, something that made my stomach churn. But I didn't say anything. I couldn't find the words. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, John's face. That grin, those eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I tossed and turned in bed, my heart racing at every creak and groan of the house. I felt like he was still out there, waiting, watching. And then, just when I was starting to drift off, I heard it. A soft tapping sound. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again, tap, 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 against the window. My heart leaped into my throat as I sat up, the shadows in my room suddenly feeling alive. Slowly, I turned to face the window. There, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. A silhouette. For a split second, I thought it was him, John. But then the figure moved closer, and I realized it was a kid. A boy, no older than me, standing outside my window in his Cub Scout uniform. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were wide with fear. I scrambled out of bed and opened the window, my voice shaky. "What are you doing here? It's the middle of the night." The boy didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his chest heaving, like he'd been running for miles. Finally, he whispered, "He's still here." "What?" "John," the boy said, his voice trembling. "He's still here. I saw him. He was at the church tonight, in the basement." My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" "The church said he's gone." The boy shook his head, his eyes wide with panic. "He's not gone. He's hiding. I saw him, and I think he saw me too." I didn't know what to say. My mouth went dry, and the room seemed to close in around me. If John was still around, still lurking in the shadows of the church, then that meant none of us were safe. The boy looked over his shoulder, his breath quickening. "I have to go," he said. "You need to tell someone. You need to make them stop him." Before I could say anything else, he turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, I told my mom everything. She was already on edge after the meeting with Father O'Connell, but this sent her over the edge. She grabbed the phone and started calling the church, demanding answers. but all she got was the same calm, dismissive response. "John is no longer with us," Father O'Connell repeated over the phone. "There's nothing to worry about." But I knew there was something to worry about. I knew it deep down in my bones. A few days later, during our next Cub Scout meeting, the air was thick with tension. Everyone seemed on edge, whispering about the incident, about John. Some of the kids had heard stories, rumors about why he'd been let go, about the things he'd supposedly done to the altar boys. But no one knew for sure. I stayed close to Mr. Parker that day, not wanting to wander off like last time. But something was different. The church basement felt darker, colder, like the walls themselves were holding on to some terrible secret. As we finished up the meeting, I felt a tug on my sleeve. It was the same boy from the other night, the one who'd been at my window. "He's still here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I looked around, my heart racing. "Where?" The boy pointed toward the far end of the basement, where a door led down into the church's old and used catacombs. No one went down there. It was off limits. But I knew deep down that if we didn't stop John, if we didn't confront him, he'd never stop. He'd keep watching, keep lurking, waiting for the right moment. I took a deep breath and nodded. It was time to finish this. We crept down the narrow, winding stairs into the catacombs, the air growing colder with each step. The flickering light from our flashlights cast eerie shadows on the damp stone walls. Every sound seemed amplified, the soft drip of water, the creak of the old wood above us, and our own nervous breathing. And then, just ahead, I saw him. John stood there, his back to us, his pale face barely visible in the dim light. He was muttering something under his breath, something low and rhythmic. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "John," I said, my voice shaking. He turned, his eyes locking onto mine, and I realized in that moment that we were in far more danger than I had ever imagined. John's eyes were darker than I remembered, almost black, as though the pupils had swallowed the color entirely. His face, pale and gaunt, twisted into that same grin I'd seen in the church. But now, standing in the catacombs, the grin wasn't just unnerving, it was terrifying. There was something wrong about him, something unnatural. The air around him seemed colder, heavier, as if the darkness itself was bending toward him, drawn to whatever he had become. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his shoes scuffing against the stone floor. My feet felt glued to the ground, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The boy next to me was frozen too, his hand gripping my arm, shaking with fear. "You shouldn't be down here," John whispered, his voice low and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves scraping across concrete. "This place, it's not for you." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Why are you here?" I managed to choke out. "They said you were gone." John's grin widened, but his eyes, they remained cold, empty. "Gone?" He chuckled, a low, hollow sound that echoed off the stone walls. "No, not gone. They couldn't get rid of me. Not from this place. This is where I belong." His words hung in the air like poison. Something about the way he said it made me realize this wasn't just about the church anymore. There was something deeper, something older and far more dangerous lurking beneath St. Mary's. "You don't understand, do you?" John said, his grin fading into something darker, more sinister. "This place, it's been here long before the church. Long before you or me. And it's hungry." My heart skipped a beat. Hungry? What did he mean? Before I could ask, the boy next to me, the one who had warned me, took a shaky step forward. "What do you want?" His voice was barely more than a whisper, but there was a strength behind it that surprised me. "Why are you doing this?" John's eyes flicked toward him, narrowing. For a moment, I thought he might answer, but then something strange happened. His face, his whole body, seemed to twitch, like he was fighting against something deep inside him. His grin faltered, and for the briefest moment, I saw something else in his eyes, fear. But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. "I don't want anything," John said, his voice cracking. "It's not me. It's this place. It needs more." Before we could react, he lunged forward, faster than I could have imagined. He grabbed the boy by the wrist, yanking him toward the far end of the catacombs, where the shadows seemed to grow thicker, almost alive. The boy screamed, struggling against John's iron grip, but it was no use. "Let him go!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the stone walls. But John didn't listen. He was dragging the boy closer and closer to the darkness, his muttering growing louder, more frantic. "It needs more," he kept saying. "It needs more." I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't just stand there and watch. My legs finally listened to me, and I bolted after them, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I had no plan, no idea what I was going to do, but I couldn't let John take him. I wouldn't. Just as they reached the edge of the shadows, I grabbed the boy's other arm, yanking him back with all my strength. For a brief moment, we were caught in a horrible tug-of-war, John pulling him toward the darkness, and me pulling him back toward the faint light from the stairwell. John's face twisted into something inhuman, his eyes narrowing, teeth bared in a snarl. "Let go!" he hissed. "No!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and desperation. "I'm not letting you take him!" Then, out of nowhere, I felt something cold and wet, like fingers made of ice, wrapping around my wrist. I looked down and saw that the shadows themselves had reached out, curling around my arm, pulling me toward them. Panic surged through me as I realized it wasn't just John. The darkness, whatever it was alive, and it was trying to pull us in. I yanked harder, digging my heels into the stone floor, but the shadowy tendrils only tightened their grip, pulling both of us closer to the void. The boy screamed, his voice raw with terror. "Help! Somebody, please!" It felt like the whole world was closing in on us. The air was so thick I could barely breathe, and the cold was unbearable, sinking into my bones. My arms burned with the effort of holding on, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep it up. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard a voice, a new voice, strong and clear, cutting through the darkness like a blade. "Let them go!" I turned my head, straining to see, and there, standing at the entrance to the catacombs, was Mr. Parker. He held a flashlight in one hand and something else in the other, something shiny, glinting in the dim light. It looked like a cross. John froze, his body stiffening as his eyes locked onto the cross in Mr. Parker's hand. His snarl twisted into a look of pure rage. "This isn't over," John growled, his voice low and guttural. But he let go. The shadowy tendrils around my wrist recoiled, slithering back into the darkness like snakes retreating into their holes. John stumbled backward, his eyes wild, his body twitching as if he was fighting something deep inside him. And then, without another word, he vanished into the shadows, disappearing completely, leaving only the cold, suffocating darkness behind. Mr. Parker rushed over to us, his face pale but determined. He helped us up, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled us toward the stairwell. "Are you boys okay?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. We nodded, still too shaken to speak. As we climbed the stairs, I glanced back one last time, but there was nothing, no sign of John, no sign of the shadows that had nearly consumed us. Just the silent, empty catacombs, dark and still. In the days that followed, the church did everything it could to cover up what had happened. They said John had left town, that he wouldn't be coming back. But I knew the truth. I knew he wasn't gone. Not really. The darkness that lived beneath St. Mary's, it wasn't something that could just disappear. I never went back to the church after that. My mom understood. She didn't push me, didn't try to make sense of it all. She just hugged me tight, like she knew the world was darker and more dangerous than either of us had ever imagined. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about John. I wonder if he's out there somewhere, still lurking in the shadows, waiting. Or maybe he's still down there, in the catacombs, part of the darkness now, forever watching, forever waiting. I never saw the boy from my window again either. It was like he had vanished, just as mysteriously as he had appeared. But I know what I saw. I know he was real. And I know that St. Mary's still holds its secrets. Because some places never let go. It had been months since I last saw Ben. After we graduated, he took off to a small, middle-of-nowhere town. He was always the kind of guy who liked space, quiet, lonely, where he could disappear into his own thoughts. So when he invited me to visit, I couldn't really say no. I figured a few days in the country might be good for me. Get away from the noise, the endless job searches, the pressure. The bus ride to his new place was long. Too long. The kind of ride where you start questioning why you agreed to visit someone so far out in the middle of nowhere. But Ben was my best friend, and I hadn't seen him in ages. I kept telling myself it would be worth it. When I finally arrived, Ben was waiting at the station. He looked good, better than I expected. His beard was thicker, and he had that laid-back look in his eyes that only comes from someone who's been living a slow life. We exchanged the usual greetings, caught up on life, and then, as expected, Ben suggested a hike through the woods the next day. "It's beautiful out there, Alex," he said with that familiar glint in his eye. "You won't regret it." The next morning, we packed up some water, a couple of sandwiches, and headed out. The woods were exactly how I imagined they would be, vast, wild, and silent. For the first few hours, it was perfect. We walked, talked, laughed, catching up on all the things that had happened since graduation. I hadn't felt that relaxed in a long time. But then, somewhere along the way, things changed. The air felt heavier, like the trees were pressing in on us, and the sky seemed to get darker, though it was barely midday. The trail we were following became harder to distinguish, until it disappeared entirely. Ben was usually good with directions, but I could see the look of confusion creep into his face. "We should have hit the creek by now," he muttered, glancing around. "Maybe we took a wrong turn." We kept walking, hoping to find some familiar landmark or sign of the path. But nothing looked right. No matter how far we went, the woods seemed endless, swallowing us whole. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon something unexpected, a clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood an old church, the kind that looked like it hadn't seen a congregation in decades. Its paint was peeling, the roof sagging, and a few of the windows were boarded up. Despite its decay, there was something unsettlingly alive about it. "Man, this is weird," I said, trying to laugh it off, but the sound came out shaky. Ben didn't respond, just stared at the building like he was deciding whether to go in or turn around and keep walking. "Let's just take a quick look," he said after a moment. "Maybe someone's inside who can give us directions." I didn't like the idea, but the thought of continuing to wander through the woods aimlessly seemed worse. So I followed him. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. It was dimly lit, only the faintest rays of sunlight sneaking in through the crack-stained glass windows. The place was bigger than it looked from the outside, but completely deserted, or so I thought. As we moved deeper inside, I noticed them, people. A small group, maybe 10 or 12, sitting in the pews. They were huddled together, their clothes ragged and worn. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared at us with cold, vacant eyes. Ben cleared his throat and asked, "Do any of you know how to get back to the main road?" Silence. The air felt thicker, oppressive, like it was trying to crush us. I could feel my heart starting to race, and every instinct screamed at me to get out. But Ben didn't move, his eyes locked on the people in the pews. "They don't look right, man," I whispered. "We need to go." Ben finally nodded, but before we could leave, I noticed something. The people were slowly rising from their seats, their heads tilted slightly, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. It was then I saw the small, almost imperceptible smiles forming on their faces. "Ben, now!" I grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. The moment we stepped outside, I realized it was darker than before. The sun was setting, though it should have been hours from that. We hurried away from the church, moving as fast as we could through the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure that the people from the church were following us. And then I saw them. At first, it was just a glimpse, one of the figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. Then another. And another. They weren't running after us or shouting, but they were there, following us silently. "Don't look back," Ben muttered, his voice tight with fear. "Just keep moving." We walked faster, pushing through branches, ignoring the scratches and cuts. We had to get out. We had to find the road. After what felt like forever, we saw a flicker of light in the distance, a gas station. Relief flooded over me as we practically ran toward it. The place was old, run down, but there was a man behind the counter inside, and right now, that was all that mattered. We burst through the door, breathless. "Hey," Ben panted, "we're lost. Can you help us find the main road?" The man, an old guy with a greasy baseball cap and a cigarette hanging from his lips, gave us a long, hard look. He didn't seem surprised or even curious about our state. In fact, he barely reacted at all. "You boys lost out there in them woods, huh?" he said in a low, gravelly voice. "Yeah," I replied, my voice shaking. "We were hiking and ended up at some old church. Do you know it?" His eyes narrowed. "Church, you say? You're lucky to have made it out. Ain't no one with sense goes near that place. Them folks." He paused, glancing out the window toward the trees. "They ain't right." "What do you mean?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping. "Which folks?" "They've been in these woods for generations. They keep to themselves mostly, but once they set eyes on you, well, let's just say you boys best be getting far away from here." The gas station felt like a haven compared to the woods, but the old man's words hung in the air like a thick, greasy fog. "Which folks?" Ben muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for me to hear. I was still trying to catch my breath, but the man behind the counter didn't seem to care much about our disbelief. He just kept his eyes on the window, like he was waiting for something, or maybe someone, to show up. The cigarette between his fingers burned down to the nub, the ash piling up on the floor in a careless heap. "You boys best be gone before night falls," he repeated. "Ain't no telling what might happen if you stick around too long." "Look," I said, stepping forward. "We just need directions to the main road. Can you help us or not?" He sighed, flicked his cigarette butt into a rusty coffee can beside the counter, and grabbed a map from under the counter. His hands were shaky, and when he spread it out on the counter, I noticed they were covered in scars, deep, jagged cuts, like he'd been in a fight with something wild. He jabbed a finger at the map. "Here," he said, pointing to a spot on the paper. "This is where you are. Main road's about 2 miles east. Just follow this old trail." He traced a line with his finger. "And it'll get you there. But you don't want to linger." I nodded, but I couldn't help asking, "What's out there? What are those people?" He didn't answer right away, just stared at us with those cold, tired eyes. "They ain't people no more. Not like you or me. Some say they were cursed long ago, others say they chose the darkness. Whatever it is, they don't like outsiders. They'll follow you, watch you, make you feel like you're going crazy. But if you're lucky, that's all they'll do." His words sent a chill down my spine, and I glanced at Ben, who was pale and silent, his eyes fixed on the window. "We need to go," I whispered. Ben nodded, but I could see the fear in his face. We thanked the old man, grabbed our bags, and stepped back outside. The air was cooler now, the light fading fast as the sun sank behind the trees. We started down the path he had pointed out, the dirt crunching under our feet as we hurried east. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. I kept turning my head, expecting to see one of those figures from the church lurking in the shadows. But the woods were eerily quiet. For a while, it felt like we were making progress. The trees started to thin out, and I could see the faint glow of the highway lights in the distance. But just as I began to think we'd make it out, something changed. I noticed it first, the silence. The forest had gone completely still, no wind, no birds, nothing. I stopped in my tracks, and Ben nearly ran into me. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "Do you hear that?" He listened for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's too quiet." We stood there for a moment, our ears straining for any sound. And then, just as I was about to brush it off as my imagination, I saw them. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the trees, quick and silent. Then another. And another. "They're here," Ben breathed, his eyes wide with terror. "Run," I said, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. We sprinted down the path, the branches slapping against our faces and the ground uneven beneath our feet. But no matter how fast we ran, I could feel them behind us, those silent watchers from the church. They didn't chase us like animals. They didn't need to. They just followed, like they knew we couldn't outrun them. We finally burst out onto the highway, gasping for breath, the bright headlights of passing cars nearly blinding us. I could hear the distant sound of tires screeching, horns blaring, but all I cared about was that we were out of the woods. We had made it. For a moment, everything felt still. Safe. But then I heard it, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from the trees behind us. I turned around, and there they were, standing just at the edge of the woods. They hadn't followed us out. They just stood there, watching, their faces hidden in the growing shadows. The chanting grew louder, like it was pressing in on me, filling my head with a dull, throbbing fear. "What the hell are they doing?" Ben whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't know, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. Just then, a police car pulled up alongside us. The officer, a gruff-looking man with a mustache and dark sunglasses, stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his holster. "You boys all right?" he asked, looking us up and down. We got lost," I stammered. "In the woods." The officer glanced over at the tree line, his face hardening. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, he looked more annoyed. Like we were just another pair of idiots who had wandered into something we shouldn't have. "You two are lucky," he said, his voice low. "That's not a place you want to be after dark." "Do you know what's going on in there?" Ben asked, his voice shaky. The officer didn't answer right away. He just kept his eyes on the woods, like he was making sure the people from the church wouldn't come any closer. After a long moment, he said, "There are things in these woods that you wouldn't understand. People who don't live by the same rules as the rest of us. Best to stay far away from them." He motioned for us to get into the car, and we didn't hesitate. As we drove away, I glanced back one last time. The figures were still there, standing at the edge of the woods, their eyes locked on us. The chanting had stopped, but I could still feel it, like an echo in my bones, a warning that we had escaped, but only just. The officer dropped us off at a diner on the outskirts of town, gave us some vague instructions about how to get back to Ben's place, and drove off without another word. As we sat there, sipping coffee and trying to calm our nerves, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of those woods. Maybe not the people, but the fear. The knowing. "I'm not going back there," Ben said suddenly, his voice firm. "I'm moving. This place, it's not right." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if moving would be enough. Some things, once they've seen you, once they've marked you, don't let go so easily. As we sat there in the dim light of the diner, I could still feel those eyes watching us from the dark.